Every 4 years, the world stops. Offices empty. Streets go quiet. Billions of people arrange their entire lives around 22 men kicking a ball across a field. Grown adults weep. Strangers embrace. Entire nations hold their breath for 90 minutes and then collapse into either collective grief or collective euphoria. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, you sit there, watching, waiting to feel something, and feeling almost nothing. Not contempt, not boredom exactly, just distance. Like you're watching the celebration through glass, present for it, but not inside it. You've probably wondered what's wrong with you. Nothing is. What's actually happening is one of the most revealing windows into how human identity, belonging, and emotion are constructed, and why some people are wired to live inside that window, and others are quietly looking in from outside. Here is what most people don't realize about the World Cup, or any mass sporting event. It was never really about the sport. Anthropologists who study collective behavior have long observed that humans are, at their core, tribal creatures. For most of our evolutionary history, survival depended not on individual strength, but on group cohesion, on the ability to feel, deeply, viscerally, that these people are mine, this group is me. Ritual was how tribes maintained that cohesion. Shared chanting, synchronized movement, a common enemy, a common hope. These weren't entertainment. They were the social glue that kept communities intact. The World Cup, stripped to its architecture, is the same ritual, scaled to a planet. The jersey is the tribal marking. The anthem is the chant. The opposing team is the symbolic enemy. And the goal, that moment of collective eruption, is the same neurological release that ancient communities felt when the hunt succeeded or the rival tribe retreated. Your brain knows this. On some level, it has always known this. The question is not whether you understand the World Cup. The question is whether your brain is wired to need it. And that, it turns out, is where the real psychology begins. When a fan watches their team score, something extraordinary happens in their brain. Researchers studying sports fandom have found that dedicated fans experience hormonal shifts during matches. Testosterone rises with their team's victories, drops with defeats, mirroring the physiological response of the players themselves. Not just emotionally, biologically. There's a reason for this. Psychologists call it BIRGing, basking in reflected glory. The tendency to psychologically merge your identity with a group's success. We won. Not they won. We. This isn't delusion. It's a deeply functional psychological mechanism. When you attach your sense of self to a collective, the collective's victories become your victories. Its losses become your losses. You gain access to a much larger emotional life than your individual existence could provide. For people whose identity is strongly tribal, who define themselves significantly through group membership, family, nationality, community, the World Cup is not entertainment. It is a mirror, a validation of who they are at the level of belonging. But here is what this reveals about those who don't feel it. If you watch the World Cup and feel unmoved, it is often because your sense of self is not primarily tribal. Your identity is more individuated, more internal, built from personal values, aesthetic sensibilities, intellectual frameworks, rather than group affiliation. You are not broken. You are simply a different architecture of self. And in a species that survived through tribalism, that architecture can feel profoundly lonely. Even when you're in a room full of people who are all, together, feeling everything. There is another layer to this, one that goes beyond identity. Psychologists who study emotional experience have long distinguished between what they call high arousal and low arousal emotional states. High arousal emotions, excitement, euphoria, collective frenzy, require a specific kind of emotional infrastructure to access, an openness to surrendering individual cognition to collective feeling, a willingness to stop analyzing and start dissolving into the moment. For some people, this comes naturally, almost effortlessly. They step into a stadium and something unlocks. The crowd becomes a nervous system they plug into. The emotion is not performed. It is genuinely caught, the way you catch a contagion. For others, often those who are more analytically minded, more emotionally self-contained, more prone to observing an experience than inhabiting it, the crowd's electricity doesn't transfer. The mind stays on the outside of the moment, watching, narrating, wondering why it isn't feeling what everyone else is feeling. Psychologist Elaine Hatfield called the mechanism behind emotional contagion primitive emotional contagion. The unconscious, automatic tendency to mimic and synchronize with the emotions of people around us. Some nervous systems are highly permeable to this process. Others maintain a kind of emotional autonomy, an involuntary distance between the self and the surrounding emotional field. Neither is superior, but they produce profoundly different experiences of mass events. The person weeping in the stadium isn't more passionate than you. They are more permeable, and that permeability, that capacity to dissolve the boundary between self and crowd, is one of the most underappreciated dimensions of human variation. But there is a third dimension, perhaps the most honest one. Even if your identity is somewhat tribal, you can still watch the World Cup and feel nothing. If you don't believe it means anything. Meaning is not automatic. It is constructed, and the construction requires investment. The fans who feel the most, who truly live and die with their team, have spent years, sometimes decades, building the narrative architecture that makes these 90 minutes matter. They know the history, the heartbreaks, the players who left, the ones who stayed, the final that was lost on penalties in 1998, the goal that should have been disallowed, the manager who was fired too soon. This accumulated narrative is what transforms a sports match into a story you are inside of. Without that investment, what you're watching is genuinely, objectively, two groups of people trying to move a ball into a net. The ceremony surrounding it is elaborate. The production value is extraordinary. But the emotional access code requires prior investment to unlock. Philosopher Albert Camus, who was, interestingly, a goalkeeper before tuberculosis ended his football career, once suggested that everything he knew about morality and obligation he owed to sport. Not because sport is profound in itself, but because choosing to care about something and honoring that care through attention and commitment, that is where meaning lives. The people crying in the stands didn't stumble into that feeling. They built it, slowly, over years. And if you haven't built it, the door is simply not open yet. That is not indifference. That is just the honest condition of someone who hasn't yet chosen to care about this particular thing. The question worth sitting with is, what have you chosen to care about that deeply? Because that thing, whatever it is your World Cup. Here is the reframe. We tend to frame the question as, why don't I feel what they feel? As though the crowd's experience is the standard, and your distance from it is the deviation. But consider inverting that entirely. The capacity to stand outside collective emotion, to observe it without being consumed by it, is not a deficit. It is, in many traditions of thought, considered a form of psychological freedom. Stoic philosophers practiced what they called prosoc, disciplined self-attention, the cultivation of an inner life so stable that external chaos, including the chaos of collective emotion, passes through you without displacing you. The person who cannot feel the World Cup may simply have, accidentally or intentionally, cultivated a version of this, an inner architecture that doesn't require external events to validate or animate it. But here's the paradox, and it is a real one. That same autonomy can produce a quiet isolation, a sense of being permanently adjacent to the moments where everyone else seems most alive. You are present for the celebration, but not in it, observant, but not participating. And over time, that distance, however intellectually comfortable, can begin to feel like a kind of exile. The resolution is not to force yourself to care about football. It is to recognize what the World Cup represents, and ask yourself honestly whether you have found your equivalent, connection to something larger than yourself, a story you are genuinely inside of, a community whose victories feel like yours, and whose losses cost you something. It doesn't have to be sport. It never had to be sport. But the need it meets, that ancient, biological hunger for collective meaning, is not optional. It is as human as hunger itself. And the people who seem to have it most fully didn't stumble into it. They chose it, deliberately, and kept choosing it. You don't have to love the World Cup, but it is worth asking what it is trying to show you about yourself, about what you belong to, about what you've chosen to care about enough to let it hurt you, about whether the distance you feel from collective moments is wisdom or armor. The billions who stop the world every 4 years aren't chasing a trophy. They're chasing the feeling of being part of something. And that feeling, the feeling of mattering to a story larger than yourself, is available to every human being alive. The only question is, what story you've decided to enter. If this left you thinking, our exploration of why humans need to believe in something, and what happens when they stop, might be the next conversation worth having. It's right here,